as having registered today, well over 100. But let's get ourselves underway. So first of all, welcome. My name's Mark Siebentritt. I'm from Edge Environment. It's fantastic to have so many people interested in what we believe is a really important issue. Before I explore that further, though, I'd just like to acknowledge that today I'm coming to you from Ghana land and like to recognise or pay my respects to the traditional owners and their elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the lands where everyone is coming together from today. Also just like to make a note that we are recording today's session. We've had a lot of people ask us to be able to provide a recording post the webinar because of such strong interest in the topic. So we are recording it and we'll be distributing that after the event. Certainly as we go along, I encourage you to put questions into the chat function. The way we've set up today is that we are going to run through 4 presentations from our speakers, and then we'll have about a 15-minute session at the end, a Q&A style session. So please, as we're going along, if there are issues that are coming up that are piquing your interest, drop them into the chat function and we'll come back to that at the end. A little bit about who we are as Edge. Edge is a sustainability services firm. We have offices in Australia, in Chile and the US, and soon to open up in New Zealand. And we have a vision of a world where unsustainable is unthinkable. And to me, one of the key challenges to that creation of a sustainable world is climate change and how we're responding to and managing climate change. And I know there's a lot of people around this call have been actively engaged in this issue for quite some time. And it seems like we're at a particular point in time where interest in climate change is at a peak across our community, and more than just our community, it's right across the corporate world. But as many of us know, that wasn't always the case. And in fact, there's been some pretty challenging times over the years. And I'm sure many of you around the call will remember going to workshops where there was outright conflict around whether climate change was real or not, and what we should be doing about it. Whereas it feels like we're at a point in time where there is much more unified agreement on the need to act. I think what's interesting to me there, if we look at local government in particular, it's long been a pioneer of the need to respond and act on climate change, recognising really very much early on that climate hazards pose a risk, not just to the built environment, to the community in general. And so when we look at really this groundswell of renewed interest in climate risk, we see that local government is once again right at the forefront, but the way those climate risks have been presented, it has started to change a lot more. And so we're seeing more discussion around issues like physical risk, for example, but also transition risk. And what does transition risk mean as we move towards a low carbon or a zero carbon economy? So it's a fascinating topic, and therefore to address a fascinating topic, we've got a wonderful panel of speakers lined up for you today. Just to let you know who, or reinforce who we've got speaking today, very happy to have Nina Keath joining us. Nina is a Senior Strategic Officer at City of Onkaparinga in SA. Tiffany Correggia is Senior Project Officer with DPI in New South Wales. Tim Watson is a Senior Sustainability Consultant with Edge in New South Wales. And rounding out our list of speakers is Donovan Burton, who's a founder of Climate Planning and really an all-round climate adaptation specialist. And I'll provide a little bit more of an introduction to each of our speakers before we go into their presentations. Wanted to recap briefly on the objectives for today. First and foremost, we're interested in exploring what those emerging physical and transition risks are for the local government sector and how they're presenting themselves. Linked to that, though, is how do we go about embedding climate risks into governance and decision making? I think this is something that's getting increasing focus as climate change starts to move out beyond sustainability teams and more broadly into governance and risk teams within local government sector. And then last of all, it would be great to be able to explore what some of those strategies are for managing and adapting to future scenarios. So that's a little bit of scene setting there. What I'd like to now do is we're going to jump straight into it and go to our first speaker, who's Nina Keath. So for those of you who don't know Nina is a Senior Strategic Planner with the City of Onkaparinga, and she spent a lot of her career looking at how to really address climate change impacts, particularly through the Resilient South Regional Climate Change or Regional Climate Partnership. Nina spent her early career as an academic at Melbourne's Monash University, looking at the ingredients required for transitioning organisations and communities towards more sustainable practices. You can tell I've been reading off that bio, but what I know about Nina is she's one of those rare people, I think, who's been able to look into what was current in the academic literature and then really look at how do you apply that on ground. And it's had a real impact in the communities and councils she's worked with. So with that as an introduction, Nina, I'd like to hand over you to lead off the speakers.
Hello, everyone. I'll just share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to start by explaining, as Mark said, that a lot of the work that we do in South Australia around climate risk is done through the regional climate partnerships. There are 11 of them, and these were formed back in 2012 when the state and federal government and councils all got together, recognising that climate change, it's a local issue, but a lot of the issues can be best addressed regionally. And so we developed these regional climate adaptation plans, and hundreds of people participated from many, many organisations right across the state and all levels of government. And these partnerships have become the foundation upon which we deliver this work. And so I'm part of Resilient South at City of Onkaparinga, but I count, colleagues from all of the partnerships as really important collaborators, and we do a lot of work together. And I saw a few of you in the chat forum, so hello everyone. Essentially what we've been doing has been engaging in a transition process, so trying to transition from one set of practices to another. And when we're thinking about trying to change, we need to think about the people that we're asking to make the change and understand their level of receptivity and ability to make that change. So we need to understand, what do they know about the climate impact and the risk, and what do they know about the adaptation action? We also need to understand, what are their existing values, and how are they being constrained or enabled by those, and how does climate risk relate to them? So do they believe that climate risk is worth managing, and can they see a way in which adapting to these risks will actually help them meet their needs? And I'm going to come back to this a bit later. They might know all about it and think it's really important, but not have the ability to do anything. So, do they have the skills, the systems, the technologies and the behaviours that are required to adapt? This is often where we fall over in government, where we'll write a lovely policy and do a big awareness raising campaign and then not set people up for success for the actual doing. But even that cannot be enough if all of those external influences and incentives aren't in place. So, do they have the money? Is the regulatory setting right? Are policy arrangements in place? All of that might be in place, but they might have an unsupportive manager or an elected member body or politicians who don't support them. And then beyond that, there's all of the macro level sort of physical systems, infrastructure. You might be trying to implement a bike riding strategy, but you don't have any bike lanes. That's a really obvious example. But also social norms can be really powerful for enabling or constraining. So a lot of our work in Resilient South and the other regional climate partnerships has not just looked at, okay, what are the climate risks and how we're going to respond, but have really taken this approach of trying to understand the people who have to respond and then supporting them on many levels to make those changes. And the result has been lots and lots of on-ground action. We've done an enormous amount of work in emissions reduction. We've been very successful with heat mapping and urban greening, a lot of coastal adaptation work, and I could go on. But in recent years, a new set of climate risks beyond just the physical risks have emerged, and we've been learning about these social, financial, legal and transition risks. I first learned about these at a conference in 2018 in Melbourne. Some of you may have attended the NCAA Conference, and I'd been to this conference in 2012, the year that we developed our South Australian regional climate adaptation plans, and that conference had been filled with people like me, so government policy people and scientists basically. And I got there and I was thinking, what on earth is going on? It was full of suits and it was lawyers, bankers, insurers and Defence Force personnel. And I was so confused, and I got such an education at this conference. And it was there that I bumped into Donovan and learnt about his governance assessment tool that he had really based on this task force on climate related financial disclosures, the TCFD, which was the word on everyone's lips at this conference, and I had never heard of. And so I got really excited at this conference because I saw finally here was a way to get climate change out of the environment and sustainability teams and beyond the realm of corporate social responsibility. I thought finally we can get this out across the organisation. You know, so many of you from local government will know that this idea of embedding across the organisation is what we desire to do, and it can be really hard. And so I thought, great, here's my opportunity. So the first thing we did was we brought together 2 of the neighbouring regional climate partnerships, and we held a series of workshops, one with our executives and one with key staff. Almost 100 people participated from 10 councils from 2 of the regional climate partnerships, and we flew in experts, and you'll recognise some of them there. There's Donovan and Mark smiling. And they basically explained to us the nature of these risks, and presumably they're going to tell us a bit more about that again today as well, so I won't go into that. But it really built the case for the need to do something about this. And the key message that I took from that, and that we've been using with our elected members and staff, is that as governments, it's our responsibility to know, manage and disclose climate risk. If you remember nothing else, they're probably the 3 words to take away from today. That's what we have to do in this new setting. Know, manage, disclose. So off the back of the workshop, we piloted the Informed City Governance Assessment tool, which Donovan has developed. It hadn't been used in South Australia before. We did it with 4 councils. And it's really important, I think, to understand that the governance assessment tool is not assessing your on-ground practice. This is absolutely an assessment of how well your governance arrangements are set up to manage these legal, financial and transitional risks. I hope I'm representing you right, Donovan. And I think if you as a council are considering doing this assessment, it's really important that you go in with that understanding, because I know some councils have come out with a low score in something and said, but hang on, we're doing really well in this area. So for example, City of Onkaparinga, we have been doing an enormous amount of emissions reduction work for decades. We got a 0 for emissions reduction. Why? Because we don't have a target. There is no governance set up around us doing emissions reduction. We haven't formalised it institutionally at all. It's purely just on the goodwill and agreement of staff. And if those staff leave, then we're vulnerable from a governance perspective. So what does the assessment do? It assesses 17, I think, indicators, some quantitative and some qualitative. And it does this via a desktop analysis and then also an online survey with staff and in-depth interviews. I really encourage you, if you're considering to do it, to do the full thing. Donovan does offer doing just the desktop analysis. I don't think it gets you to where you need to go just doing the desktop analysis. That's my personal view. I think that the capacity building that is enabled by staff participating in the survey and the interview process is really important, and then rounding back and in that sort of shared learning. So So we did really well. We came out number 3 in Australia at the time. I don't know where we sit now, Donovan. He's laughing, maybe not so good anymore. But despite that, there were some really important gaps. So these were the 4 councils that participated in the pilot in South Australia, and you can see their assets. None of us were doing a very good job there. This was cause for concern because not only, does this pose a whole series of physical risks, add on top of that your legal and your financial risks, and it's a really important gap. So how have we responded? At Onkaparinga, we set up an internal working group at a manager level. These are people who are tasked with responding to the recommendations in the report. The report's great because you basically get benchmarked against other councils and then a series of very practical recommendations around how you can lift your ranking. One of the things that was very interesting to me is that our staff and councils responded really well to being ranked. That's not something that I find personally motivating, but it turns out a lot of people do. So that's part of Donovan's genius, is he's tapped into human psychology. So one of our partner councils, Marion, got number 1 in Australia. Everyone's working really hard to try and knock them off the post. And no one wants to be a low performer. We've set our working group up so that we report to our audit and risk committee. This is really important from a governance perspective so that we have some accountability around responding. To me, my internet connection's unstable. I hope you guys can hear me all right. And region,
you're just breaking up a bit there, Dina, but keep going.
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me all right now?
Yeah, can hear right now. You've got about 1 minute to go.
Yep. Okay. So, yeah, we've also worked really closely with other councils, and we're now at over 20 councils have undertaken this assessment. So we know that our success really only works if everyone else is also doing it. And so one of the recommendations was to do a climate change risk assessment for our services, which we're doing now. But we've also embarked on a major project looking at asset management, and we've just gone out to tender for a project manager for that. It'll be a 3-year project looking at how on earth do we understand our risks to our assets and embed it into our governance arrangements and fund a response. Everyone agrees we need to do it. No one knows how. There's lots of really interesting work around Australia, so we are looking to what others are doing and piloting that here in South Australia and hoping that we can share it with other councils. So key benefits. It responds to existing institutional values and needs by making climate change a legal and a financial risk rather than an environmental issue. So coming back to that framework that I started with, organisations are already set up to have a strong focus on legal and financial accountability and avoidance of liabilities. This works really well with that set of values. It identifies common sector-wide gaps and issues so we can work together to respond to those gaps. You get clear recommendations about how to respond. People love that. We get really clear accountability, and it's very easy for us to link it in with our existing governance arrangements. It allows us to track our improvements over time, and it justifies investment in a response. So we've just raised just under $600,000 for this assets project. I'm certain that we couldn't have raised that money without the governance assessment providing the case for our, showing that we were exposed. Other reasons why I think it's worked is because we invested not just in a product, which some other councils have done, and I don't think that worked so well for them, but a real process. And we created a strong community of practice across councils, and we really engaged our senior leaders in storytelling. So really understanding why this is relevant to them, and bringing in people like Donovan and Mark and legal advisors really helped with that narrative and storytelling. And that's that. If you're thinking about doing it, give me an email and I'm happy to chat and answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nina. And you mentioned there that NCAF conference back in 2018. I think I had the exact same experience of thinking we'd gone from a bunch of sort of climate scientists around 2008, 2009 to all of a sudden the room was full of bankers and insurers, and it was a bit of a shock to the system. But, you know, as the way you've described, it's also changed the narrative around how we're looking at climate risk. And disclose, I don't think was a word that was in our vocabulary very much going back 5 or 10 years ago, but it absolutely is now. So thanks for outlining the journey your council and your region have been on. Now to a different part of Australia, and another insight to, I suppose, a different window or lens on climate risk is with Tiffany Correggia from DPI in New South Wales. So Tiffany is a Senior Projects Officer in the Climate Change and Sustainability Division of the Environment, Energy and Science portfolio within DPI. And Tiffany's in the Preparedness team of CRANS, which is Climate Risk and Net Zero Emissions, and has a broad range of experience in the past, including work across circular economy, various parts of state government and local government. So Tiffany, we're very grateful to have your involvement today and looking forward to your insights on the topic.
Thanks, Mark. And hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I will attempt to share my screen and the right screen. Is that the right screen?
It's not up just at the moment.
Oh, sorry.
That's looking better.
Okay.
Yep, there you go. You're up.
Okay, perfect. Is that still the right screen? Sorry, we always use Teams and I'm terrible. Hang on.
We can see the slides, but that's better. That's screen sharing mode. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. So hi, everyone. So as Mark said, I'm Tiffany Correggia from DPI. I sit within the what we call CRANS, which is Climate Resilience and Net Zero Emissions. And my team is called Climate Preparedness. So effectively, we are tasked with supporting and enabling the state government of New South Wales to be better prepared for climate risk. But we do have a number of functions within our team where we actually have some regional representatives. So we have someone who's in the Orange region. We used to have somebody who was on the mid-north coast, someone in the Hunter region, someone down south in Wollongong. So we do have quite a lot of regional representation around helping to support local government as well. While my role is quite focused on state government, I'm going to go a bit of a canter through sort of reflecting on, I guess, and following on from what Nina was saying, you know, where we were and sort of where we are, and I think where we're going. And it's been quite astounding, I think, from a state government perspective as well, to see that change that Nina was talking about. You know, 5 years ago, it was all environment, sustainability people in the room. And, you know, just yesterday, we had a community of practice of financial, you know, all the CFOs across government saying, help, what do we do? Climate risk, this is a thing. And it's just the rhetoric is really changing. It's really changing to that governance, that risk perspective. And my team, or my team leader actually sits, so one of the big drivers for us is my team leader sits across both New South Wales Treasury and the Environment Department. So we're sort of half in that greeny space, half in the sort of finance world. And she sits within the Sustainable Investment team, which really shows you sort of the angle at which state government is coming at this from. You know, climate risk is a financial risk. It's a financial risk to the state balance sheet. Any risk that we don't account for has a higher risk of us having some significant expenditure down the line. So I definitely second that sort of change in reflection. I'm just, again, going to go through, I've got, I think, 10 minutes and I'm just going to, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, so I'm not going to go back into the science, you know, I'm making the assumption here that we are all an audience who's been in this world for a while, but I'm just going to kind of just reflect a little bit on what climate risk is in terms of how we view it from a state government perspective, opportunities and challenges for government, and again, sort of thinking about where were we in terms of the opportunities and challenges and how that reflected on our programs and our support, and, you know, what are the emerging issues, where are we going to? So again, climate risk, from our perspective, it's the key risks arising from acute and chronic climate change. So acute being a sudden shock, and chronic being systemic over time. So I know we're here today to mainly talk about the physical and transition risks, and obviously they are the definitions under the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, and both are, but there's also, I guess, in terms of government, we need to start thinking about liability risks as well, and that's something which is increasing day by day. There's more and more case law around that liability risk, and so that's something which as state government we are very aware of. So example of climate risk might be service disruptions, damaged or destroyed assets, health impacts, reputational damage, loss of habitat and biodiversity. If you think about the range of functions within local government and within state government, we cover such a broad range of services, of assets. It's just, if you think about where climate risk can impact, it's very agnostic. It covers all levels of government, all sectors in some way or another. And I guess just to reiterate, the way that state government view this and the way that it is changing around the world, climate risk is a financial risk. You've got a quote there from Guy Debelle and Mark Carney, and people are looking towards what are those institutional responses. It's the credit rating, it's the insurers, it's the financiers. We're not just talking about the sort of environment and sustainability side. People are looking to decarbonize their portfolios. I was reading yesterday that it's I think 50% of all venture capitalists list ESG investing as one of their top priorities. What does that mean for us? Climate litigation increasing. So there was a piece which I'm sure everyone may have read, but there was the Hutton report, which was in 2016, and then there was a kind of follow-up piece of work by the Centre for CPD, who looked at, okay, what is the responsibility of public authorities around disclosing, and what is their duty of care? And that's, when we looked at the Hutton report, that very much was, it's a thing, we need to look at it, climate risk. Now we are really looking at, okay, what is greenwashing, and are we actually, is the rubber hitting the road? Are we actually living up to what we are saying in our strategies? And we're saying, yes, we address it and we understand it, but are we actually delivering on that? So that's a real big emerging risk, I think, for governments in general. So again, looking across New South Wales government priorities, you've got risks and opportunities, because with the risk does come opportunity too. We mustn't forget that. So we've got risks across, there could be physical assets, your infrastructure, also your services, and your objectives as an organisation as well, through to investments and finance. And obviously that translates directly to, it's the same issues we have with local government. You've got your physical assets, your community facilities, your government buildings, your infrastructure, so your roads, bridges, footpaths, the services that you provide. Again, also your objectives. What are your objectives around regional development? How does climate risk impact there? As well as investments and finance. So just to step back a little bit as well, the New South Wales government, we are under the New South Wales Climate Change Policy Framework that expires in 2022. It's currently under the next CCF is under development. But one of the key intentions in that is around making New South Wales more resilient to a changing climate. And within that was also this net zero emissions by 2050, which has been kind of supported and supplemented by the New Zealand net zero roadmap. So just thinking about, because I know Mark asked me to sort of reflect on where we were and where we're going to, and there's been a number of programs which we have helped to support with local government. So we had local adaptation pathways program that started back in 2008. We had some programs under the WASSIP funding. There was also a program under the statewide mutual liability scheme, and then we had a series of grants which were in a partnership with local government New South Wales around building resilience to climate change. And one of the key ways, I guess, that we as government kind of look at to mark how we're progressing in terms of addressing climate risk is we have a survey. So we have a survey which goes out again via LG New South Wales. We do the same thing with state government as well. So this survey just asks a whole lot of questions around, you know, whether you think climate risk is a big risk to your organization, and effectively, what are you doing about it? So we did one in 2015 and one in 2018, and there will also be another one coming out towards the end of this year. So again, we have one for local government and one for state government. And for state government, we report those results to the Asset and Liability Committee, which again kind of shows that changing rhetoric. And so for local government, we found that 44% of respondents indicated that they had a climate change risk assessment. We think, and that was only the response. So we think it's higher than that within local government, but I guess climate change risk assessment being one of the frameworks and processes in which we try and, as government, support and enable people to actually address and treat climate risk. So just quickly going through, we had a big process, you know, as Nina said, it's all about, you know, it's about local, regionally addressing climate change, making those connections in the regions. And so this process called Enabling Regional Adaptation started in 2012. You can see all the regions that we have there. And that process really was around getting the data, having some sector focused workshops. Then we had an integration workshop looking at, okay, there was vulnerability and there's some adaptation responses. What are the models of key regional systems? And then we kind of developed some first step projects. So I guess, you know, the first one was basically done in 2012, but then the most recent one was in 2019. So they are quite different. And, you know, we're sort of going through a process now of, okay, what do we do? Do we go back to those that were started in 2012 and we kind of make an adjustment and revise them, or do we go for a different model? So we also support in partnership with LG New South Wales, some grant support. So I talked about the IRCC grants, but we've just signed the third round of the IRCC grants, which is about integrating that risk of climate change. So that was $3.5 million over 4 years, and we're in the third round at the moment. There's 2 streams within there. There's local councils, and then there's also community groups and NGOs. That's just a quick sort of demonstrating the spread of those BRCC grants. The objectives of that IRCC program around actions to address climate risks, adaptation actions as risk treatments, and there has to be that measure of improvement within there. The key criteria being, you know, addressing existing climate risks, partnering and collaboration. That's one of the really key criteria. And how do you scale it and how do you repeat it? This just demonstrates all of the councils which were funded under the final round. So they're undergoing now. They were only funded in December 2020. So they will run to the end of the CCF. And just to show it was a bit of a broad range of different programs. There were some around developing these kind of practical toolkits, which was from the Canberra Joint Organisation. Mid North Coast, they had a partnership with Charles Sturt University to actually deliver these kind of micro modules to develop kind of leadership in climate risk. And then there was another one in the Murray River Council who partnered with the Western Murray Land Improvement Group about kind of building the community together. And just to show that, so with the ERA, so the Enabling Regional Adaptation, there was 2 different phases. So the first part was really that vulnerability assessment. So getting all of the data, getting all the right people in the room, from emergency management through to sort of landscapes and ecosystems, and coming up with that regional kind of vulnerability assessment, and then creating these adaptation pathways. So how do you go from business as usual through to a transformed system? And that helped us sort of identify, you know, where the vulnerabilities are and where we could actually move forwards and with those adaptation pathways. So just to sort of reflect again on, so these emerging issues. So I think the point we were at sort of 5 years ago was very much around get the right people in the room, get the data together. You know, obviously one of the big functions we have as state government is in New South Wales, we have the NARCLIM model, which is run by our science team. And that's about, okay, how do we take all these pockets of data and pull it together into something usable at the right scale for state or local government in New South Wales. So I think, so it was really much, it was around that, identifying the vulnerabilities, identifying the adaptation pathways moving forwards. And this is very much for state government as well. You know, we've been on this journey of what we call kind of building this authorizing environment. So starting with, okay, it's just a few people over here talking about this, to how do we know that our executives, our leaders really understand, you know, the importance of this issue. What are the policies we can put in place? We, unfortunately, unlike Victoria, we don't have a big piece of legislation. We'd love one, but we don't have it, and we have to work within the policy and regulatory framework that we have at the moment. So 5 years ago, we really were at that, who are the right people in the room, what's the data that we need to know? And now we really are, you know, I think in some ways we are in both local government and state government. I think there's still there are some leaders and there are some laggards. But I do think that we are kind of moving into that new space in terms of, okay, what is the liability and responsibility? The number one question we get asked is, A, do I have to do this? B, you know, am I liable? Am I responsible? How do we integrate that with planning regulations and requirements? You know, often we do get asked to comment on local environment plans, and we could ask, you know, can you just tell us we have to do this? But how does that translate? If we have a net zero emissions roadwork up here, how does that then translate into the commentary that we can give around land use planning and things? What are the new data requirements? You know, do we need to adjust our data? There are some nuances in NARCLM which mean that sometimes it's not usable for certain scenarios. How do we move on with that? But very much in-house capacity building. So one of the key things that we try and do as state government are support people to have these skills in-house. I think we definitely need technical support, we need expert opinion, but I think, as Nina was saying, it's not necessarily about a product, it's about a process, and it's about, you need to embed that in-house. You need to make sure that that person or that role remains in-house. You know, it's not just a person and then they leave and then you lose all of those skills. It's okay, but this is in the IP&R framework, whatever it might be, and it's a process which we need to continually do and we need to report on. The rubber hitting the road, I think, again, it's around that, okay, we've all agreed and we've strove towards this strategic goal, but okay, we actually need to do it now, that it is the time of action. And integration with, so one of the key things that we're finding challenging is around the integration with mitigation programs as well. You have a climate, you've declared a climate emergency. What does that mean? How does that fit in the process? You know, where can they support each other? Where are the cross dependencies? All that sort of thing is a challenge which I think we are addressing. And I'll just very nearly finish because I think I'm running over. So just to show you a bit of a quick snapshot, how are we building and developing support? So as I said, I think we very much worked around that, building knowledge, building the authorizing environment. So we have the preparedness surveys within New South Wales government. We report to the Treasury Asset and Liability Committee. We did the regional vulnerability assessments for local government. So within state government, we've also integrated into our internal audit reporting policy. So that's a Treasury policy, which basically says that every state agency must look at all emerging risks, and it calls out climate risk and cyber risk. So building the agency capacity and skills. So what we have as New South Wales government is a program called Climate Risk Ready, which I will just zoom on to, which is around, okay, how do you actually build those capacities in-house? So we have the Climate Risk Management Guide, which is online. That's basically how to, if you're starting tomorrow, you want to go from where you are now to a climate risk assessment, you know, moving up this kind of maturity curve in terms of embedding it within your organization, what can you do? So that guide is available. It's aimed at state government agencies, but it has a lot of applicability to local government as well. And alongside that, we have some nationally accredited training, which goes into a lot more detail in terms of how you can actually do that. And by the end of that training, you actually have done a climate risk assessment. So that's all available via the Adapt New South Wales website. There's also some great resources on the LG New South Wales website as well. Just to finish off, this is, you know, the thing. So what could you do today? You need to improve your authorizing environment, build the skills and capacity, embed and mainstream, and report and improve decision making. And that includes things like you could have a climate risk officer within your agency or within your organisation to oversee the management of climate related risks. Sorry, I absolutely sped through at the end. Sorry.
That's right, Tiffany. I think you nailed it in terms of showing us that journey that councils have been on, which is fantastic. And to me, the takeaway there is CFOs coming together in the room. Who would have thought 5 or 10 years ago you would have had an audience of CFOs engaging in this topic? So thank you so much. I'm going to keep us rolling along. If anyone does have questions, I can see that we've had one added into the Q&A button down the bottom. So Tiffany, that's one for you. You might like to respond to while we're going along. And any other questions that come up as we're moving, please add them in there. So we're next going to go to Tim Watson. Tim is a senior consultant with Edge Environment. I think there's not a piece of infrastructure that Tim probably hasn't looked at and thought about how do I do a climate risk assessment on it, from railway lines to tunnels through to council assets. So Tim, looking forward to your perspective on emerging risks.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thanks to everyone who's already spoken today. It's been really interesting. And I'm very happy to be here. My name is Tim Watson. I'm a senior consultant with Edge Environment. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit today about climate risk assessment in practice, just covering off on physical risk and transition risk and how we do that at Edge, as well as a little bit of what we think the future looks like for this space. Just wanted to kind of start by acknowledging or just going over the basics here. And basically, when we're looking at physical or transition risks, we're really looking at two quite different futures based on a lot of different assumptions about what the climate's going to look like, what the population's going to be, and most importantly, what the emissions are and the concentrations of those emissions in the atmosphere. So we've got in this chart here, RCB 8.5, that high emission scenario that we're probably all familiar with. What would that future look like? And we use that future to understand and stress test our physical assets, our physical environment. On the other hand, for transition risk, we want to look at the low carbon future, what that might mean for our organizations, our local governments and the services that they provide. And that's basically the frame we use, and that's touching a little bit on scenario analysis. But the key message is that these different pathways have really different physical and socioeconomic implications, and we need to understand these so we can be prepared for whatever future we actually do end up with. So in terms of addressing physical risk, obviously you guys all know what physical risks are, I hope, or I'm guessing. So we're talking about the impacts of temperature, of rainfall intensity changes, storms and cyclones, duration of drought, and the impacts of bushfire. We want to note here as well that there's those physical impacts on the built environment, which are very clear and they're already accumulating and happening as we speak. But they also have social, financial, economic, liability consequences that we need to be aware of too, particularly in the local government space. The physical risk approaches that we employ, I'm not going to go through the details here, but they're informed by a lot of guidance that's constantly being updated. So standards, state government guidance, some of the stuff that Tiffany mentioned, other practice notes from IPWEA, for example. There's lots of resources out there, and they're constantly evolving and changing. So obviously recommending that you guys kind of keep on top of what those look like and what the guidance looks like. Our approach to physical risk really takes it goes down a pathway to help prioritizing what the really big issues are for physical risk. And as we go down through these steps, we increase the kind of granularity or the detail of the assessment. The initial pieces around exposure are looking at the climate context, what the actual climate future looks like for a particular location, tapping into loads of different data sets that we've got available. Sensitivity is about understanding how sensitive are these particular assets or services to the different effects of climate change and those exposures that are in place. When we bring those two together, we can understand with adaptive capacity what the vulnerability of the system looks like, as well as the different elements inside the system. This leads us then to a risk assessment approach, which is that kind of standard ISO 31000 risk assessment approach that's been adapted for the climate change context. We run workshops. There's loads of different ways we can undertake these kind of assessments, and they really get down to the details of what the risks are how they're controlled, what their ratings are into the future, whatever time periods you're looking at. And then the last piece is obviously focusing on what we need to do to address those risks through adaptation. So that's through approaches like adaptation pathways that really provide a strategic plan as to how to adapt, not just giving you a list of actions that you don't know where to start with. So those first three approaches are really a desktop approach, setting the physical, climate and vulnerability context. The last two around workshops, engagement, speaking to people, getting on the ground to really get that detailed understanding of what the risk context looks like. In terms of what the outputs look like and what you can expect from the different stages, the first parts are mapping tools, interactive vulnerability dashboards, including all the data, portfolio level insights from across your whole portfolio of assets. Down the other end, it's detailed risk registers, adaptation pathways and plans, as I mentioned. I'm also going quite quickly because I'm aware we're sort of running short on time, so forgive me for kind of the speed, but we're getting through it. In terms of addressing transition risk, which is what that transition to the low carbon future looks like for our society. So we really need to think about these as well as opportunities. We need to transition to a low carbon future. There's so many opportunities that can be captured through that process. If we don't do much about it or we don't get prepared, they're going to be risks. So these could be impact from policy, regulation, technology, markets, business models, etc. Reputational risks around not transitioning early enough. And as I said, this low carbon transition presents huge opportunities as well as risks for local government context. So this is really guided by, I think, and spurred on by the TCFD recommendations and informed increasingly by what's going on in industry. We've got insurers, banks, mining companies, all sorts of entities that are really getting stuck into transition risk and understanding what it means for them. It's driving increased commitment to net zero pathways, etc. The approaches so far that we take are aligned with those ISO 31000 risk management frameworks, but we've adapted them to have a larger focus on the details of what that future scenario looks like, including the socioeconomic assumptions, in alignment with published and publicly available emissions scenarios. We also focus here, instead of on the kind of asset level, obviously we're looking at corporate and service level impacts of transition. Excuse me. Our approach follows a similar pathway, but we really set up with scenario development at the beginning. We then look to engage different stakeholders, recognizing that this often involves people, high levels of organizations that need to be aware of what this means for strategy. We undertake risk and opportunity assessments. We also implement and develop adaptation pathways in this space to inform how to plan for transition risks into the future. This is also followed by more detailed assessment. The further you go down this, the more detailed you're getting. And we're looking at costing and financial analysis of risks to really understand what these transition impacts mean to the future. And there's a bit of a summary of the different kinds of things that you might expect out the back of one of these assessments. The outcomes of transition risk and opportunity assessments are a detailed understanding of the transition context for the pathway or the scenarios that you select. A summary of what the vulnerabilities and opportunities of transition look like, the pathways to how we can actually plan better to react to and preempt the changes that transitions are going to bring, as well as that detailed financial analysis. And we've partnered with Frontier Economics to support us in this space. In terms of what we see is coming next in the space, what we're seeing, as Nina mentioned, to operationalize climate risk, it's really important. It's fine to know that these are all the risks that we face in the stormwater systems and in the assets that we have, but how can we operationalize it? I think that is going to be a really big piece of the next steps in this process. We're going to see improved scenarios and data for both physical and transition risk, and kind of improved sophistication of scenario planning in general. We're going to have increased pressure to report on risk metrics and targets, as well as report and disclose those transition plans that are in alignment with the Paris Agreement. Just like countries are having to do this across the world, more and more organizations are going to be driven to do this as well. We're also going to see more immersive tools, simulations that help us to evaluate risks more accurately, as well as I see an increase in the resilience focus, which doesn't just look at risk in and of itself. It looks at how we can treat risk with awareness, reduction, adaptation to residual risk, and response when all your adaptation actions just don't quite work, and you need to have that emergency response component, particularly for the physical risk context. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it, and happy to take any questions in the session at the end. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Tim. And I know you've covered a lot of territory there, but I suppose one of the important points is around physical versus transition risk, and really the rise of transition risk. And transition risk is really, pivoting now towards you, Donovan. It's one of those things that's coming out of international drivers around responding to climate change. And I think for those who don't know Donovan, I would regard as one of Australia's leading climate adaptation practitioners. And I think he has a real knack for looking at global trends and working out what they mean at a local level. So Donovan, to continue on, I'll hand over to you. And just for everyone listening in, you'll note that we are going to run up a little bit shorter time. So I'm proposing that we go over by about 5 minutes at the end to provide a little bit of time for some Q&A, but understand if people need to move on.
Great, thanks, Mark, and thanks, everyone. Look, I think, Mark, what I'll do is I'll just spend, I reckon, 3 or 4 minutes, because I think the conversation afterwards is probably going to be much more exciting. And so I wanted to, I guess, I always press for the need for governance to be bookended by sort of good metrics and ongoing monitoring and evaluation. And so I want to just very, very briefly unpack cascading risk and what that means for local governments and state agencies and anybody in the public sector. And I think it's really important to note. So as was mentioned before, the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, now was voluntary, or some call it voluntary. Now that's being used for surveillance. And so now as organisations disclose those statements around how they're responding in the private sector, SEC and in Australia, ASIC and APRA are actually starting to undertake surveillance of what that actually looks like. So that puts a lot of pressure on the financial system and on all privately listed organisations to understand and disclose those risks. So think about this I guess let's unpack that. Across the ditch where I do a lot of work in New Zealand, there's the new Financial Sector Climate Risk Disclosure Amendment and Bill is actually tabling up to 5 years jail time for individual directors for failing to meet the climate risk disclosure standards. So as you can imagine, the pressure is starting to get quite significant to understand those risks. And whilst we all know about the physical impacts of what might happen for the council or the individual areas, the cascading risks are interesting. So what we will see is we probably see potentially in some locations the end of a 30-year mortgage. It might end up being 10-year mortgages for the banks to deal with that risk. And actually, if it's for the bank, they have to deal with their own liability and ethics for lending in an area that if they're only going to lend for 10 years, that means that the area is at risk and maybe they shouldn't lend there at all. So that's starting to be unpacked at the moment as well. So what does that mean for local governments who are thinking that it's going to be, development at full steam ahead in certain locations? And I can tell you now that the banks are not using the same maps that you're using. So if you worry about, if we release these maps, it will influence the mortgage sector, then it won't. And the banks are seeing the way local governments respond and the lines you draw around as uncertainty risks. So they don't know how you're going to respond. So you need to fess up and show, and sooner rather than later show, is it plan to retreat? Is it stay and defend? Because they want to know, the sooner they know you're going to do something there, the sooner they can also respond. And then the next one is they're really feeling the heat around financed emissions. And of course, that could be things around coal, but it's also becoming more and more around how much of the agri sector are they financing. So, the meat sector is the next coal industry. And not only are banks actually stepping away and actually starting to quantify their financed emissions, and I've been doing that quite a lot lately, is they've actually gone through processes where they're looking at by 2050, no financed emissions by 2050. So no houses that they lend will have embodied energy, no bridges, no roads, no organizations. And that's where we need to be. So they get it. That's where we need to be. So they need to make those statements now. So as an organization and as a local government, you need to start thinking, where is the market responding? Because I think they're really starting to overtake that space. And so I think the key questions is you need to think about how do local governments support ratepayers to transition to a low carbon economy, and how do local governments support ratepayers to obtain insurance and affordable insurance and lending, because they're I think the key issues in that space. And of course, you've got to look after yourself first, and that's where governance is critical. You know, I fly a lot, and you know, often they say, you know, bring down the oxygen masks on yourself, because you start falling apart quite quickly before you help others. And so the key, I guess the key message and the take-home message I wanted to say is that governance is critical, absolutely fundamental. A risk assessment by itself is not enough. An adaptation plan by itself is not enough. You need the governance to have the glue together to bring the oxygen on yourself so you can look after your own entity, and then also start planning to see and help those who you support. I think I'll leave it there, and we can have a conversation. I think it's the best way to do it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Donovan. I think one of the themes that's run right through this session today is how, while local government's been looking at climate change for quite some time, the rise of things like TCFD and legal liability has also been really significant. And we're at a point now where the two have come together. So we recognise that banks, insurers, other parts of the financial services sector are having a direct impact on our communities, which ultimately means it's impacting councils as well. I'm conscious that I've had a few messages come through from people saying they're keen to see the slides and share the recording, because they do need to get going. But one question I'd like to put to each of our panelists is the classic magic wand question. Sunita, I'm gonna come to you on this first, and just ask everyone to keep their responses fairly brief. But if you look at the challenges that either your organisation is facing or the local government sector in general, if there was one major change you could bring about, what would it be?
Oh my God, you have to start with me, Mark.
Everyone else is thinking they're happy they didn't get that one first.
All right, the thing that I think I would like to see, what I observe in all of my colleagues and peers is a unanimous acceptance that they need to respond, but many of my colleagues don't believe that they have permission. And this comes back not only to governance, but also to culture. So I would like, if I could wave my magic wand, I would like all of my colleagues and peers to feel that they have permission to respond to this. So a lot of my time is taken up telling them that they have permission. So whether that is, you know, saying they have to because they're legally obligated, or they can because their CEO or their director says it's okay, or they can because there's other councils doing it, so they're doing it, so you can. I just wish everyone knew that they could, that it's okay. And the minute they start doing it, they realise, oh yeah, this does align with my work. Why wasn't I doing this earlier? I wanted to. So there you go.
That's great, Nita. I love the sort of take on framing it as permission. Often we talk about roles and responsibilities, but permission kind of cuts to the chase of it. Tiffany, let's pass the magic wand over to you. What would you do if you had that magic wand for a day?
I think other than a big piece of legislation dictating that everyone has to do something, I think, you know, I think some clarity around the disclosure and the legal obligations for directors of public companies. I think that it still is a little bit woolly. I know there's no science in law, but at the same time, I think there's a bit of clarity, I think, will go a long way in terms of what are our duties as a public organisation in terms of our disclosure and our duty of care to, you know, intergenerationally. So I think some clarity around that, I think, would go a long way.
I think that would resonate with a lot of people. Tiffany, I know I was only on a call yesterday talking about TCFD with a risk committee for a publicly listed company. And there was a point in the discussion where someone said, whoa, what are our legal obligations here? When they started to realise how widespread the climate impacts could be. So absolutely hear you on the importance of legal obligations. Tim, let's pass that magic wand around to you. What are you doing with it if you had your chance?
Thanks, Mark. I think I would somehow communicate or instill the kind of scale of this challenge that we're facing in the need to adapt both to a lot of physical change, because inevitably we're going to end up somewhere in the middle of those two pathways where we've got physical change, but we've also got the transition. I mean, we've already got that now. So I think acknowledging the scale of the challenge is super important. It's happening, but I think it needs to happen more. And just general commitment and understanding of how much work really needs to be done for us to be resilient to those physical impacts of climate change, as well as align to the Paris Agreement and reduce emissions to reduce the warming, obviously, as much as possible. So
I think it's a really interesting observation, Tim, and I think we're all probably aware of discussions where when people are considering impacts of climate change, they're looking at their historical experience of climate events. They're not necessarily saying, well, what does a 50-degree day mean for our communities, for example? So scale of impact is absolutely important. So Donovan, we've talked about permission, we've talked about legal obligations, and we've talked about scale of impact. Handing over to you, what would you do if you had that magic wand for a day?
Yeah, I would force public disclosure of public entities of the risk. So, and it's a magic wand, but it's also I think watch this space in the next 18 months that will come, whether public entities want it or not. It's been a political football in Australia, and so information is held, and so local governments, state agencies, state-owned corporations have a significant amount of risk that they're not disclosing. They have a significant amount of responses as well that they're not disclosing. And we need, if we're going to have a TCFD, which we do have, and there's expectations around the private sector, for me, it's in the public sector. And I think that absolutely in 18 months from now, we'll be able to go online and see where all of our state and local government agencies sit alongside companies around, so we can have informed decision making.
So really, in that sense there, it's even though local government's been ahead of the pack for a while, there are now a lot of disclosures happening in the corporate sector, and probably state and local government catching up on some of that. Look, there's a temptation to sort of keep this discussion rolling, but I know we committed to finish it a couple of minutes ago. So what I'm going to do is suggest that we do wrap it up, but I feel like this is very much the start of a conversation that could keep rolling. So what we're going to do is we'll actually be sending out a copy of the recording and also the slides. We'll also be doing a survey. So if there are particular questions or topics that have sparked your interest today and you're tuning in, we'd love to hear from you, and we'd look at really having what might end up being a part 2 or a phase 2 of this conversation. So in rounding things out, can you join me in thanking again Nina Keath, Tiffany Correggia, Tim Watson, and Donovan Burton. It's been a fantastic conversation. As you can see, we've had a lot of great feedback coming through the chat and the questions as well. So have a great day, and look out for our summary email off the back of the session. Thanks everyone.